transactions in the world. In fact, it's been practiced since ancient times. Historically, in Canada, the act of exchanging sex for money has been legal, while the acts surrounding the transaction have been criminalized, which makes it difficult to practice. In 2014, Canada adopted new laws to protect exploited people. But not all sex workers are exploited. Sex work is a complex and diverse métier that encompasses a lot of types of work. It includes, but is not limited to, street and indoor prostitution, brothel work, phone sex operation, exotic and pole dancing, webcam modeling, and pornographic movie acting.
Sex work is the exchange of sexual services, performances, or products for material compensation. It includes activities of direct physical contact between buyers and sellers, as well as indirect sexual stimulation. In Canada, the act of exchanging sex for money has historically been legal, while the criminalization of activities surrounding the transaction have made it difficult to practice some forms of sex work without breaking any laws. In 2014, Canada adopted new laws aimed at protecting exploited and trafficked people. However, the laws actually harm sex workers. The term sex work refers to consensual and voluntary transactions and is therefore preferred since it grants more authority and autonomy to sex workers. Throughout most of the world, people mistake sex work for trafficking, and it is regarded as a dangerous and exploitive profession. It is true that sex workers are more likely to experience violence and poor health than the general population. But is it correct to depict all sex workers as victims? No, and here's why. Sex work is a complex and diverse métier that encompasses different types of work. It includes, but is not limited to, street prostitution, indoor prostitution, such as escort services, brothel work, and massage parlors, phone sex operations, exotic and lap dancing, webcam modeling, pornographic film acting, and peep show performing. Both men and women work in the sex industry. Based on a 2014 study, whose figures correspond to participants in the study, 77% of sex workers identify as women, 17% as men, and 6% as other genders. The figures are representative of the sex industry in Canada. However, it is important to note that there are no reliable numbers to indicate how many sex workers are active in Canada. Since it is stigmatized, there are few sex workers who report their careers to any governmental agency. This video will focus on women in the sex industry, more specifically street sex workers and non-street high-end escorts. Street sex workers solicit customers in a public place, usually at the street level. Non-street escorts are typically women who are paid for companionship. Their job can involve sex, but that is not the only thing that they are paid for. This video will examine the laws and how they impact sex workers. Finally, it will also examine the relationship between sex workers and those who enforce these laws. Legislation in Canada does not differentiate between trafficked and exploited women and girls and sex workers with authority and autonomy, despite a clear difference between consensual sex work and human trafficking. The idea that all sex workers are trapped and victimized does not reflect the majority of sex workers in Canada. There is a group of sex workers in Canada who are in crisis. These individuals experience poorer health on average compared to other Canadians. They are more likely to experience violence than the general population and are more likely to be discriminated against or arrested. This group does not accurately represent the experiences of most sex workers in Canada. Vulnerability is not inherent to sex work. This video segment will provide an in-depth look at the current sex work laws within Canada. The legislation being examined is the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, specifically Provision 213, entitled Stopping or Impeding Traffic and Communicating to Offer or Provide Sexual Services for Consideration, and Provision 286, entitled Prohibition Against the Purchase of Sexual Services, the Commodification of Sexual Activity. So what do the laws really say in Canada, and how do they impact sex workers? Before beginning a discussion on the laws themselves, it's important to look at why there has been so much focus on them and what the court case led to changes. In the case Attorney General of Canada versus Terry Jean Bedford, Amy Lebovich, and Valerie Scott, known from here as Bedford versus Canada, sex workers argued that they too are professional women and the laws keeping them from operating a common body house and communicating for the purposes of prostitution perpetuates violence against women. After a lengthy legal battle, the Supreme Court of Canada delivered a unanimous decision ruling 3 provisions of the Canada's Criminal Code, Section 210, keeping or being found in a body house, Section 212, subsection 1J, living on the avails of prostitution, and Section 213, subsection 1C, communicating in a public for the purpose of prostitution, violates Section 7, right to security of the person protected by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada. The sections in this question do not merely impose conditions on how prostitutes operate, rather, they go a critical step further by imposing dangerous conditions on sex work. These sections prevent people engaged in a risky but legal activity from taking steps to protect themselves from the risks. After striking down the old laws for being too harmful, Canada implemented new laws. These new laws continue to be restrictive and put sex workers in precarious work environments. Now to examine the specific provisions mentioned at the beginning. Provision 213, stopping or impeding traffic and communicating to offer or provide sexual services for consideration, is only marginally different from the pre-Bedford laws. It has made illegal communicating to offer sexual services in a public place where anyone under the age of 18 could reasonably be expected to be present. But what does a public place mean? This term is problematic. The new laws of communicating captures a broad range of places where communication is prohibited. Public place can mean any school, mall, or neighborhood where street-based sex workers may be operating. It places a large restriction on where they are able to go in order to carry out their business arrangements. This is significantly problematic for street-based sex workers because they are more visible on the streets and become larger targets of law enforcement. This is counter to the goal of the Bedford case, which was to give more safety to sex workers, but instead they are fearful of the police and move to areas where they become vulnerable to make a deal with an individual in order to avoid criminalization. The next provision that this video will cover is provision 286. This provision criminalizes everyone in any place who purchases or communicates in order to obtain sexual services. This criminalization places tough punishments on clients and now sex workers who are forced to communicate with people willing to break the law. This puts sex workers in danger of interacting with predators. By placing a criminal conviction on anyone who purchases sex, clients begin to worry about their own safety and take their own precautions to remain anonymous. Furthermore, because clients want to remain anonymous and avoid alarming authorities, they make it harder for sex workers to screen them. As was discussed with Jen, who is a former street sex worker, screening clients becomes difficult because they use burner phones and creative ways of remaining anonymous. The new laws were put in place because they were supposed to protect sex workers' rights to Section 7 of the Charter of the Rights and Freedoms, the right to life and liberty. However, the communication laws change the levels of safety provided for sex workers and not in a productive way. Their lives are constantly at risk because they are forced into situations where clients fear the police and do what they can to hide who they are. In an overview, what exactly is legal and what are the gray areas? Sex work is legal. However, purchasing sex is illegal up to 5 years imprisonment. Advertising sexual services is illegal. This includes print media or websites and can result in a maximum penalty of 5 years imprisonment, where prosecuted for indictment and 18 months for a summary conviction. The rationale is that the promotion of sex work contributes to the demand and the government wanted to prevent demand. The material benefit offense criminalizes receiving a financial or material benefit obtained or derived from the commission of the purchasing offense. And finally, the procuring offense is where individuals can be imprisoned up to 14 years for attempting to reach out and bring someone into the sex work industry.
So let me be clear. No model that involves full criminalization or legalization will ever make prostitution a safe endeavor. There will always be an inherent danger in this degrading activity.
First of all, let's look at the name of the legislation. The Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act. As was seen in the previous segment, a large number of sex workers are willing participants and go into the profession because they want to. If the government were serious about making sex work safer for women, they wouldn't have started off by undermining their autonomous decision to engage in sex work. Despite what the legislation says, most women are not victims. Because of the narrative, all women are victims, the new laws are actually more harmful to sex workers than previous to the Bedford case. The new laws drive the purchasing of sex underground, and clients are seeking more isolated and dangerous locations. And by doing so, make safe sex work virtually impossible. Individuals are constantly trying to avoid persecution by denying sex workers a safe place to operate and an ability to communicate and screen their clients. The new laws don't reach the expectations that were had for sex workers in the Bedford case. According to Amnesty International, working in isolation places sex workers in a vulnerable situation at risk of robbery, physical assault, and rape. So if the new laws are considered safe for sex workers, why are they pushing them into further isolation? It's time to call on the government to reevaluate these new safer sex laws.
Marginalized, victimized, addicted, and abused. Amongst other terms, these are the common stereotypes associated with the men and women involved in the sex trade. When people hear the word sex work or prostitution, they tend to imagine a drug-dependent promiscuous person wearing skimpy clothing and standing on the sidewalk soliciting sexual services. However, people tend to neglect the varying forms of work opportunities within the sex trade industry, ranging from street-level prostitution to upper-class escort services. Although there is an extensive list of reasons why people tend to degrade sex workers, the chief cause remains that sex work in general opposes people's moral and ethical principles. Thus, sex work becomes a crime of morality. Since street-level sex work is the most publicly visible component of the sex industry, society tends to stigmatize and reject the presence of sex workers entirely. The implications involved with this type of mindset is that it fosters an environment of intolerance and negligence, thereby portraying sex workers as a nuisance of society. As a result, people rely on the police to intervene and to suppress the alleged criminal behavior. However, what happens when the police officers also engage in this damaging rhetoric of victimization and slut-shaming? Police-prostitute interactions are often referred to as police roulette, in the sense that officers behave in a number of ways when interacting with sex workers, some of which are beyond the appropriate use of discretion. In fact, street-level sex workers have historically experienced disparate levels of interactions when dealing with law enforcement officials compared to their upper-class counterparts. However, there exists a harmful narrative within the culture of policing that heightens the risks for sex workers because they sometimes perceive police officers as people who accentuate the cycle of oppression. These sometimes include interactions classified by sex workers as brutality, misconduct, and abuse of authority. Although these types of communications are not representative of all interactions shared with police officers, their perspectives shed light on a systemic issue that occasionally presents itself when sex workers are approached by police officers. One of Canada's most notorious crime case displays evidence of police misconduct, notably in their lack of action towards the investigation where sex workers were alleged to be the primary victims of abduction. In fact, in 2001, 65 women, most of whom were street-level sex workers, were found on a farm in Port Coquitlam after being kidnapped and subsequently being brutally murdered. Over the course of 6 years, the perpetrator managed to remove these highly vulnerable women from Vancouver's downtown east side, while his crimes went virtually unnoticed. As these events unfolded, 2 primary police services within the jurisdiction of Vancouver and Port Coquitlam became involved in the investigation of the suspicious disappearances of these women in Vancouver's district, notoriously known to have high levels of sex work, drug use, along with a painful combination of other issues. Subsequent sentiments by sex workers in Vancouver indicated a profound distrust of police because crimes against the marginal woman involved in the sex trade industry weren't considered a priority. So how have times changed? Recent studies on police sex worker interactions have revealed that communications with the police are healthier than they were in the past. In fact, many police services throughout the country have adopted collaborative frameworks that seek to instill trust in the police's ability to protect sex workers. However, there is still much work to be done. Jennifer, a current street-level sex worker in Ottawa's sex trade industry, stated that street-level sex workers are not seen as human beings by police, compared to upper-class sex workers who are more respected. The reason for this is addressed by Celia Williamson and Linda Baker in their article entitled Police-Prostitute Interactions, Sometimes Discretion, Sometimes Misconduct. Their research concluded that there exists a very prominent discrepancy between police interactions with street-level workers and other upper-class categories of the sex work trade because of the social exclusion and stigma attached to this occupation. Similar to the negative perceptions of sex workers described earlier, police officers sometimes share the common attitudes against street-level workers. As a result, sex workers on the street are not afforded the same privileges and protections as other individuals in a democratic society, including the fundamental recognition of value as a human being and the protection of the full extent of the law when victimized. This goes without saying that upper-level street workers still do encounter interactions with the police, due to the provisions of Bill C-36, which states that the purchasing of sexual services is illegal. Police services regularly conduct prostitution sweep operations as an attempt to capture the Johns who purchase sex. However, these operations have been reported as problematic by some sex workers, as they are often intrusive and intimidating. One instance in Ottawa found the municipal police force conducting a human trafficking sweep operation but came across an upper-level sex worker who thought that her in-call client had arrived. Alternatively, it was the police. She claimed that as a woman alone wearing clad clothing, to have 4 men walk into your apartment thinking that it is the client is very, very intimidating. Although police worker interactions are predominantly perceived as being invasive and threatening, several police services in Canada have adopted more sensible policies to foster open communications with sex workers to prevent violence through prioritizing their safety over enforcement measures such as arrest. For instance, the Vancouver Police Department has implemented some guidelines into their enforcement strategies that shifts the focus in policing sex work away from pressing charges against sex workers. Unfortunately, there is still a fear of repercussion when sex workers call police. However, the ultimate goal for police services is to instill trust with sex workers to ensure that they do not hesitate calling for help when in need of assistance. The controversial federal bill that changed the laws around sex work has been in effect for just over 4 years now. Police in this country have since adopted different strategies to target those purchasing sexual services by shifting towards a greater use of undercover stings and patrol of areas where street-based sex work occurs. Because of this, sex workers have expressed concerns over the heightened safety risks because of the displacement of isolated areas, the inability to screen clients, or safety to negotiate terms of transactions, and instability to access police protection. But why is the focus narrowed onto sex workers who choose to engage in the occupation? What about those who aren't? Human trafficking is on the rise in Canada, and statistics show that a quarter of women are being lured into sex work are under the age of 18, and 47% are between the ages of 18 to 24. Traffickers and pimps are increasingly taking advantage of men and women by exploiting them for sexual purposes. This creates an environment of manipulation because those providing the services are being physically, psychologically, emotionally, and financially abused by the controlling trafficker, which is entirely different from those who willingly choose to get involved into the sex trade. It may not seem like it, but the unthinkable is happening in our own backyards. Police services across the country should shift their focus away from sex work enforcement strategy towards the prevention and control of human trafficking in Canada to help those who are trapped in the dangerous world of human trafficking. In relation to prostitution laws, the terms legalization and decriminalization contrast each other greatly and play a key role in determining what effects further stigmatize and discriminate against sex workers. The legalization of prostitution allows the government to control some of the harms that are often associated with sex work. Legalizing prostitution allows for particular ways of sex work to be conducted, as it protects the general public, but not the sex workers. Everything surrounding the legalization of prostitution is aggressively criminal, and therefore there are no rights for sex workers. In contrast to legalization, the decriminalization of prostitution is seen as recognizing sex work as a job that has regulations just like any other business. A concrete way in which these differences take shape can be seen by examining Canada's controversial laws on prostitution versus the progressive laws that New Zealand has put in place. By turning towards the unconstitutional Swedish model, the Harper government decided to criminalize the advertising and buying of sex, but decriminalize its sale, thus driving sex workers further underground. This new law, entitled the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, positions sex workers as victims, even if no exploitive or coercive situation is involved. As this bill does not define what is meant by sexual services, it makes all sex work criminal in one form or another, thus creating stigmatization. Also, by making all sex work criminal, the new regulations criminalize the clients, which furthers the workers' isolation and risk of violence, thus resulting in less engagement from sex workers with health and social services. As there are no official public health guidelines or regulations to promote sex workers' health and safety in Canada, sex workers are left to rely on intuition and dangerous practices. These regulations make it less safe for people in the sex trade to do their jobs. Proponents of the new law believe that this Swedish model is right because it punishes people who buy sex, not those who sell it, whereas opponents of the law believe that it forces sex work further underground as it criminalizes the advertisement of sex, thus allowing those in the sex industry to screen their clients ahead of a meeting. Sex workers are forced to work alone to avoid the threat of arrest. By criminalizing prostitution, the Government of Canada is focusing on the act of prostitution as the source of all problems in the sex workers' lives, and they are essentially creating victims where its aim to help the lives of sex workers is New Zealand. Sex work in New Zealand was not illegal before the Prostitution Reform Act of 2003, and its sex industry has operated since the early days of European colonization, with governments enacting various laws to address its activities, including acts against prostitutes in public streets behaving indecently, as well as the Contagious Disease Act of 1869, where the periodic medical examinations of a prostitute could be ordered. Anxieties about prostitution heightened during the First and Second World War and in 1978, which is when the Massage Parlors Act was passed, aiming to supervise and regulate the industry due to fears of crime in brothels. Activism amongst sex workers increased during this time, with the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective establishing itself by 1987. They aimed to support and educate the sex industry workers, and in 1989 they presented their first arguments for decriminalizing prostitution to a select committee on justice and law reform. The calls for decriminalization intensified after their initial proposal, as there was growing public awareness of the sex industry and the dangers it posed to sex workers under the current legislation. In 2003, New Zealand became the first country to decriminalize sex work with the passage of the Prostitution Reform Act. With this act, sex workers were able to have access to the same protections afforded to other workers in other businesses. Ultimately, this law aims at safeguarding the human rights of sex workers, protects sex workers from exploitation, promotes the welfare and occupational safety and health of sex workers, creates an environment conducive to public health, and protects children from exploitation in relation to prostitution. The Act includes several regulations such as prohibits persons under 18 years of age to participate in prostitution, operators of prostitution businesses must adopt and promote safe sex practices, brothel operators must hold a valid certificate and can have no more than 4 sex workers hired, and the authorities can make bylaws regulating the location, signage, and advertising associated with commercial sexual services. All of these regulations offer safety, security, and health benefits to sex workers instead of making them feel discriminated, isolated, and victimized. A committee was also created to assess the PRA's operations at the time of the enactment, as well as 3 to 5 years after its implementation, and they found that it was effective in achieving its purpose, and they were confident that the vast majority of people involved in the sex industry are better off under the PRA than they were previously. New Zealand's law focuses on empowering sex workers themselves and gives them greater control over their work. New Zealand recognizes that sex workers are the best people to advise on their own working conditions and realizes that significant positive changes have occurred in relationships between police and sex workers, as they are now supporting sex workers' safety strategies and enables them to take their time when meeting with clients. So what should Canada do to further progress the health and safety of both sex workers and clients?
Currently, Canada's Swedish model of prostitution laws criminalizes the purchase of sexual services, therefore making people think that sex workers are safe by ending the demand of prostitution. However, sex workers believe that this endangers their human rights and puts them at risk for future danger. Canada should look towards the New Zealand model as it is inclusive, tolerant, and successful. New Zealand's current prostitution laws enable health, safety, and human rights for sex workers, therefore having less exposure to exploitation and risk at work. For a country as diverse as Canada, a government that is progressive, and a Prime Minister that asserts he is a feminist, it is odd that the Liberals have not yet repealed the Constitution laws of 2013. No law is perfect, but the New Zealand approach may be the best thing we have to supporting sex workers' rights and facilitating access to justice. This Swedish model is unconstitutional and very misguided.
Current initiatives happening throughout Canada and even here in Ottawa. Pivot opened in 2001 and focuses its effort on the most tangible human rights in order to improve the immediate situation of those people dealing with health and drug policy, homelessness, and sex workers' rights. They are committed to decriminalizing sex work as they believe it is necessary to step to protecting the safety and rights of sex workers by ensuring they have full access to health, safety, and human rights. They introduced Know Your Rights cards in 2013 to inform sex workers which of the activities related to their work are illegal under the PCEPA, with the hope that they can help sex workers stay safe until the laws are changed. They have worked with the Vancouver Police Department and created guidelines that require officers to prioritize sex workers' safety over law enforcement, such as no harassment or targeting, arresting, or intimidating of sex workers. You can donate, volunteer, or attend events to help out and get involved. Purple Bridges was founded in 2016 here in Ottawa and aims to address the service gaps for outdoor survival of sex workers in the Vanier neighborhood. It is a 4-person team comprised of 2 individuals with lived experience in outdoor and the survival of sex work, as well as 2 of their allies with several years of relevant frontline experience. They recognize that outdoor sex workers face staggeringly high rates of violence and marginalization, as there are very few places where workers can feel safe and welcomed. There are currently no services in Ottawa that operate 24 hours a day that are specifically designed to meet the needs of this population. Their ultimate vision is to establish permanent 24-hour programming in the Vanier community that specifically meets the needs of outdoor sex workers. For more information, please visit the Purple Bridges Facebook page.